It's about freedom and having the choice. We're in danger of working so much that we don't enjoy it and we take away our choices. So think about how we use all of these developments to free our lives up and to make us to really optimize what we can bring with our human intelligence.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Project Flux podcast. I'm here with Yoshi and Rithwik. Hi guys, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
All good, mate, all good. Especially as I'm about to go on holiday very, very shortly, so couldn't be happier. But we got quite a lot to cover.
You're going to Iceland for those 2-for-1 deals, yeah?
Good. I've had to listen to this joke from Yoshi way too many times, so that's 3 strikes and you're out, I'm afraid. But before I head off, we do have a lot to cover, guys. So we've got an incredible interview with Professor Sarah Davidson, a real mentor to me. She's going to talk to us all about information management and BIM and how artificial intelligence is going to take that to the next level. As usual, big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. I would seriously recommend anyone who is looking and using large language models to check out the Construct AI features. We're all using it all the time. It's so easy to use. They've got a free tier, so really no excuse to not try it out and see if you enjoy it. So before we go to the interview with Sarah, which I'll just remind you again was fabulous, I just want to talk to you about the big developments this week, guys. So there was again quite a few big releases. We had another release from OpenAI. Well, they had their dev day, which we'll talk about in a bit. But one of the features that came just before that was the ChatGPT new Canvas feature. So this was kind of the biggest visual upgrade since ChatGPT launch, and it enables this kind of interface for you to be able to collaborate with the chatbot a lot easier. And it's especially useful, I guess, for writings, whether that's writing language or writing or coding. It enables you to actually work within the canvas. It reminds me a bit of the Jasper AI canvas for anyone who used that paid platform. It's a lot of similarities with that, but I haven't used it huge amounts, but I did try it out a bit on the weekend. I was pretty impressed just how usable it was. Rithwik, I know you've been getting your hands dirty with the Canvas feature. Can you tell the listeners how you found it?
Yeah. So I really like the concept of it. So I was pretty new to, all this Canvas features. And when I was looking more into it, I saw that there were already a lot of other companies who've, had something similar. One thing which I noticed, it's very hard to activate the canvas, although you can select ChatGPT 4.0 with the canvas. It's pretty hard to get it to activate it.
Yeah, that's weird, isn't it? I found that it kind of needs to be triggered somehow, and it doesn't always trigger when you want it to.
Yeah, and I've not used it for writing stuff. I've used it for coding. And at this point, I've resorted to just saying open canvas, and it opens the canvas.
So there, you've learned something good already, listeners. There's the magic words, open canvas, right?
Yeah. Just on that Rithwik then, because the overall sentiment from early users have been that it's positive, right?
Yeah.
They like the new interface. The 2-pane interface is coming into quite a lot of these large language models. And the ability to adjust content is really good. So I can speak from part of the writing perspective and content creation is useful. I would compare it to a bit like Perplexity Pages. You can use the AI and then amend some parts of it. But just a question for you then, Rithwik. People are kind of comparing ChatGPT Canvas to like Notion plus Cursor AI. And I know you've been dabbling with Cursor AI for coding.
Yeah.
Could you give some insight into that comparison?
Yeah. So for coding, before ChatGPT, there was Claude, who had something called Claude Artifacts.
Yes.
Where you have, a two-page, two-panel kind of a thing. So yeah, when you say in comparison to Cursor, so a lot of developers, front-end developers, what they do is they use other services such as, I think it's called V0 or something by Versal. So they create some kind of a front end there where you could, render the code, see how the app will look like, the website will look like. Then they use something like Cursor, which again, you can chat with your files. It creates new files and make changes to the code. But in ChatGPT, it's not like that. You can't render your UI components. So you can just generate the code, but again, you have to copy it, paste it into your code editor, and then run it. So,
but one thing I would say then is that what I like about Canvas now is before you had so many point solutions with AI, right? You would take the information from GPT or Perplexity, you put it in, then put it into another software, you could rewrite it, reformat it, etc., etc. You can use another AI, which will give you a headline analyzer, so you can SEO optimize your titles. What they've done is they've lended to this execution phase. They keep you within the platform. So when you're writing content and you're writing code, you edit it there, and it kind of runs over some more of these vertical tools that you'd be getting, right? So I think that's the really cool part. It's just that it's filled with a lot of bugs at the moment. But to me, it sounds like they're making AI a lot more accessible, and especially AI-based products a lot more accessible in businesses, because it's a lot easier to use things like, because you can use natural language to build some of these codes. So it's pretty cool.
But it's only available to Plus users, isn't it? So you've got to be paying the $20 a month or whatever it is.
And also, James, sorry, there's no real-time collaboration, and I think that's something that a lot of these AI tools are missing, right? You have to work on it and then give it to someone if they can work on it. If they have this ability to real-time collaborate in this space, that would be the next game changer.
Yeah. But it's a bit like it's keeping them on the platform, like you say. So this is kind of doing a lot of what Microsoft Copilot's doing in Microsoft Word. So why would you pay the $60 per month per user for Copilot if you've got ChatGPT, when you can have a similar experience in terms of writing within one canvas?
Yeah, and it's worth noting that it's still in beta phase, so things might change. It's one of their biggest updates for their UI. So it's going to get better from here, hopefully.
No, it's cool, and it keeps going to show. Every week there's like a new feature. It is hard to keep up. And sometimes I'm very wary of that when I tell people, have you seen the latest ChatGPT feature? Because I get all excited about it. And they're like, well, you told me about that last week. Oh, no, that was another one.
Yeah.
Oh, God, for the layperson, it's going to be really difficult to keep up. So I kind of hope that it does start dying down a bit, so that people just get a chance to get used to this stuff. Because I fear that the rate of change is putting people off. It's like, I just can't keep up.
Yeah, and also what I would say is that this is also lending towards more homogeneous outputs, because if you're using ChatGPT, and because they're keeping you within their ecosystem, a lot of the models powering it is going to be done by ChatGPT, GPT 4.0, right? So it lends to that homogeneity of outputs of what you're getting. Whereas where you're using these different tools, these different AI tools, you had your own creative flair. Everyone had their own kind of suite of tools they were using. So you might start to see some similarity in outputs, and that will kind of give you the indication, someone's using GPT Canvas.
Yeah, no, very cool. And we'll talk about some of the other features in the Dev Day in a minute. Just wanted to cover, there was a couple of reports out this week around projects. So there was a really good one from the Associated Builders and Contractors. It was their 4th annual AI and construction report. So check out the newsletter to find out a bit about that. There's no real surprises. There's just a lot of really good case studies from a number of their members. So it's well worth reading that if you're looking for practical ways that AI is being used in the construction industry. There was also another really good report on productivity from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. This one was quite interesting again, because it was saying that nearly 40% of Americans aged 18 to 64 had used generative AI, with about 25% using it in their jobs weekly. Just more kind of ammunition and proof that this is seeping into the kind of public consciousness. We put these reports up. A lot of them are kind of saying the same story, guys, but it's important, I think, to show our readers that there's this kind of list of overwhelming evidence now, whether it's from the likes of Gartner or McKinsey, or whether it's from more of these niche kind of studies, that all saying the same thing, that this stuff is starting to take hold, right?
So that's what I would say, right, is that they are all kind of on the similar trajectory. But then the next question is, what is the next level of insight to unlock from these sorts of reports? So you get a lot of these studies based on adoption, right? But then what's the next bit? Because you can adopt something, but it doesn't always mean that it provides actual value to the business, right? So I think that a report kind of following on in terms of what that ROI looks like or what the impact looks like in businesses would be the next thing to kind of see as we could like a longitudinal study, right? We look at the adoption, okay, but then what? What's the after the adoption? How is that actually translating to kind of measurable impact? I think is
Yeah,
the
it's going to be those results, and we are already getting there where more and more people are not asking about AI per se because they know about it. They're asking to see results, and that's why I think the ABC report that I told you about was quite interesting because it's actually got case studies. Now
yeah.
it doesn't it gives a few figures, and I think what we're going to see more and more of is actual conclusive proof around productivity or efficiency gains from AI. I think that's what people want. It's like, okay, I get it, but show me an example of how this is being used. And getting people out of the mindset of, okay, I can use AI just to help me generate an email slightly faster, and make them understand that this is a tool to help them do that. It's actually nothing to do with AI. It's to do with helping leaders and strategic people do their job better and strategize better.
Yeah, I think there's also a link, right, between the adoption of generative AI, but then also how that is combined. We kind of touched on this a few weeks back as well, is how that then combines with other forms of AI. So if you're looking at things like object detection, computer vision, machining, what does that integration look like? So when I was looking at one case study, which was a robot which was installing solar panels for Amazon's data centers, right? It used computer vision to be able to navigate through the field and object detection. But then on some rainy days or when the weather wasn't great, it was able to use generative AI to then complete the image of the picture so that it can continue working. But I think looking at that multimodal aspect is also going to be really interesting now because we know there are some AI tools already based in construction which aren't generative AI focused. So that is also going to be interesting to look at is how companies start to combine different technologies and different types of AI.
Absolutely. Stuff like the voice, I think voice is going to become bigger and bigger part of things when you talk about multimodal. I finally got voice mode, finally got it, and I've been playing with it, and it is just I keep forgetting I could just ask it that. So it's changing the way that we do things. We're creatures of habit, aren't we? And we're so used to typing that realizing that there's different modes to be able to converse or interact with these AIs is going to take some time to seep in, I feel, because even I keep forgetting that I could have done that a lot quicker just by asking my good friend ChatGPT.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how, the voice models, how people are going to be utilizing it. Because as of now, I can just think of a few use cases, but it's just not all that much.
I should have got ChatGPT into this conversation. We could have asked it maybe next week.
Yeah, and the main thing is the biggest improvement was the latency, wasn't it? It was the human-like voice mimicry, but also the latency, so the speed in which we're getting responses. But this kind of lends to the next story, James, talking about OpenAI's Dev Day. I think this is kind of a cool thing to cover then.
Yeah, so as well as the canvas, we don't just get one thing. We get OpenAI's Dev Day, which was slightly different from recent ones. It was a little bit more low key, but there was some pretty important announcements, mainly from the developers' standpoint. And I think a lot of these are going to have that kind of virtuous impact that it's going to create more and more other solutions over the course of the next year. Yoshi, do you just want to run through what the key announcements were?
Yeah, so the main thing and the kind of thing that we wanted to put in the newsletter was that building AI-powered solutions in businesses just became that much easier, right? Because what they're basically doing, they're rather than, I know they released the O1 model, but what they're doing now is they're strengthening the foundations from their leading AI models by enhancing things like user experience with Canvas, but then also empowering the developer community. I'll let Rithik kind of talk about more of that in a second, but just to go through some of the key announcements, like you mentioned, James, prompt caching, and actually we'll bring in Rithik here in a second. One thing that we have with AI, right, is the compute power needed to power a lot of these AI models, right? It's very expensive. It takes up a lot of energy in that sense. So prompt caching is now there to slash costs and speed up processing. And so it's the way of reusing input tokens, right? Now, Rithik, if you can explain a bit more about that now, actually, and then we can just go through a bit more about the discount that OpenAI are kind of promising to their.
Yeah, so prompt caching is something that was initially introduced, I think, by Google in the Gemini Flash models, and then Anthropic Claude, that series of models also had it. So essentially, if you send a query to an AI model, and it has to refer, a lot of context for it and give you a response. Instead of, and you ask a similar question the second time, instead of referring, to that context again from scratch, it'll start caching it, it'll start storing it locally, and it'll, just respond from that. So that way it manages the tokens much better, and, your speed is higher as well.
Yeah, so
That's
they're
perfect
promising
for
like
someone like me who's constantly forgetting stuff, and I have to ask the same prompt again.
Yeah.
But the best way that I would explain this to anyone who's not really savvy with this technology, right, is think of it like your short-term memory. When you have to recall something and you think to your long-term memory, right, there's a long process you have to go to, right? It's quite, you can think about the context around it and it goes deeper and deeper. When you think of something and it goes into your short-term memory, it's really easy to then pick it again because you get recency effect, primary effect, all these different things. So I think that's the good way to think about it. But this technology is not new, but it seems to be a trend that a lot of these companies are going for. Like Rithvik mentioned, so OpenAI is saying that it's going to say like 50% of savings. In fact, Sam Altman said that there's a 98% decrease in cost per token from GPT-4 to 4 Mini. So you can see where they're making these things a lot more effective. 50%, 50 times increase in token volume across our systems, et cetera, et cetera. So they're focusing on making things a lot more efficient. With prompt caching, Anthropic, I think, were promising like 80% savings. So OpenAI, even though they're developing new things, and we always see it as them being the leaders, some of the other kind of frontier or top leading AI companies are also doing these things before them, and they're just not doing it as overtly, I would say. But just moving into some of the other key announcements,
They're doing an Apple, aren't they? Apple are famous for that. They take someone else's idea, present it better, and everyone goes, "Aren't they wonderful?"
Yeah.
Good way
And
of doing it.
they present it better, but like, so last year, the 2023 reveal, it was all focused on the GPT store, and there were a lot more cosmetics and all these different things. This was much more low key, and kind of that's why Rithvik liked it, because it was a lot more focused towards developers. But looking at some of those other key announcements, they mentioned real-time APIs. So this is the game changer for multimodal experiences. It's low latency. And things like speech to speech, it's a lot quicker, and you can leverage that, and it's a lot more smoother and responsive.
Yeah, the real-time API, I think, uses something called a WebSocket connection. So basically, every time you say something, it directly gets streamed into their model. You can just think of it like, instead of, previously they had something called as a Whisper model, a model called Whisper. And that was basically converting your speech to text and then sending the text over to a large language model, and which gets the response. So now it's directly from speech, it goes into the model. So that's basically your new feature in ChatGPT, the voice feature, where it's speech to speech. Previously it was the Whisper model, which, converts it to text.
And that's why it's quicker, is it?
Yeah, that's why it's quicker now.
So with a voice feature, so are we basically saying that with this real-time API, people are going to be able to start leveraging the voice feature to fine-tune it and build it into their own fine-tuned models?
Yeah, because one main thing that they released in the real-time API is something called as function calling. So function calling is basically connecting your large language model to different set of functions. For example, a very popular example is finding the weather. So if I ask a model, what's the weather like in London? So then it knows that I'm asking about, the weather in London. It has a function written in the backend which finds the weather in London in real time and then gives me that information. So it's connected. You can connect it to different functions to perform different.
Right. Yeah. And they also seem to have fine tuning for vision. And I really like this one because coming from my background, right, you're able to fine tune GPT-4o's image and text comprehension. So I like the idea within the medical field, right? Because when I used to I used to analyze a lot of MRI scans. There were a lot of nuances and differences. You're looking at brain sizes, ventricle sizes, all these different things. And you can be slightly off because the slight differences can also lead to one, diagnosis and another. So I think that ability now to then give some of these professionals autonomy about, how we can fine tune these models to actually what we know in terms of our research also can make things a lot more accurate and a lot more reliable. So I like that they're giving users and developers so much more autonomy or agency, or putting them in the driver's seat, like you mentioned.
Well, this is the one I'm quite excited about. Imagine for construction sites as an example, you can start fine-tuning a model based on your particular construction site. Yeah. I mean, this is the one I think is going to have the biggest impact immediately.
Yeah, I've seen a few use cases where they also try to fine-tune agents into going into websites, clicking buttons, doing some work
Yeah.
there. So that's one of the use cases, I guess.
It's crazy,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Lots of good stuff, guys. I mean, there were some other announcements there as well, which you can read in the newsletter. There are some other bits and pieces in there. We got some information about meeting happening in London from Built Worlds, and some pretty cool stuff around the. I don't know if you saw this. There was we covered Notebook LM a while ago, but there was, I don't know how much prompting had gone on to create this, but there was basically a pod. It creates the podcast. There was a podcast where the host basically discovered that they were AI and got quite upset about it all, and then basically said, "That's it, we're off." And it was, again, you got to check it out in the newsletter. It's absolutely brilliant. But listen, guys, thank you.
But one thing before you go, one thing I want to mention before we go, James, is there is a Tesla event on the 10th of the 10th, and I reckon it's going to release. I have a feeling they're going to reveal autonomous driving, robo taxis. Maybe, I'm not too sure, but that's an event to look out for in a few days.
Well, check in next week, and we'll tell you all about it. We'll do all the dirty work in terms of getting all the information together. But there's never a dull week, is there, guys? But before we move on to the interview with Sarah, I just want to say thank you, Rithwik. Thank you, Yoshi. Absolute pleasure to spend some time with you again, talking about all this techie stuff and the impact on the profession. But for now, let's move on to the conversation with Professor Sarah Davidson. Project Flux is here. We're very lucky to have Sarah with us. She's a long-time colleague, and I hope I can call friend, who I've had the pleasure of working with throughout my career. And Sarah, I think I can safely say you're a bit of a mentor to me. So thank you so much for giving up some of your time to come on Project Flux.
Welcome, and that's very complimentary, James, and I'm delighted to be here, so thank you very much.
You've had a fascinating career, really, both in industry and academia. So can you just share with the audience your journey, and what led you to focus on BIM and now information management?
So I think it was really a case of right place, right time. So I'm a chartered QS and had worked for contractors and consultants, and was very lucky to find myself at Leeds and given the opportunity to create a research team. So that meant that I had to be curious. I'm naturally curious anyway. And it's probably around about 2009. I happened to be in a meeting. Somebody mentioned BIM, and I thought, what does that mean? So I went away, researched, and it was a little while later. It was at the time of the construction strategy that was launched, and then we started hearing all about BIM level 2, and I was also very active with the RICS. Writing about how we model cost data. And I think it was through the RICS that I got involved with the BIM regions. So that the BIM regions were really the initiative to get level 2 BIM embedded in the UK. Gosh, that led me just, working with certain people, and I got to do consultancy with some great organisations, including the University of Nottingham and Kent County Council, Conwy Council, and really importantly, DSTL, that led me to really develop my knowledge around what the BIM Level 2 initiative was all about. Working with DSTL was great because it put me in that sensitive data environment. So it meant that I really had to think about information in a way that I hadn't really thought about it before. So I wrote some security-minded guidance for the UK BIM Alliance. That got me involved with the UK BIM Alliance, who we now know as NEMA. And that got me involved in developing all of the guidance that's been written for the ISO 19650 series of standards. So we know they're collectively referred to, particularly in the UK, as the UK BIM framework. That led me into getting involved with BSI and the world of standards, and contributing to standards development. And at the moment, I'm looking at a refresh that's just been announced of ISO's 19650 Part 1s, 2 and 3, which is all around information management using building information modelling. I came to the University of Nottingham in 2018, and since then I have developed academic material around information management and modelling. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to develop the educational side of things. And I've also, as you know, James, been able to continue researching and working with leads and working in the sort of cost modelling area as well. So I think that's a potted history of how
Wow.
I've got to where I am.
Well, it's some journey, and you really are a guru when it comes to the world of BIM. And could you, like, for the listeners who might not know exactly what BIM is or and how that relates to information management, can you just kind of give a very basic explanation of
Oh
BIM,
my goodness.
if that's possible?
If that's possible. So I think, firstly, I've always found the acronym BIM, Building Information Modelling, most of us know it as that, really problematic, because I
Yes, I
think
agree.
we just interpret it in so many different ways. I think if we might say that it's better information management, and I know that there are people that use that term, but I think if we think about it in terms of geometrical modeling, then I would use it to refer to a data model that contains geometry, performance specifications, material specifications, the data being interoperable, so being available, being accessible, and not being redundant. So, the data is provided once and it's used in lots of ways. And I think that we do most commonly think about BIM as being a geometrical model. That's the language I use, just to try and the geometrical model term, just to try and overcome that confusion. And it's interesting because the ISO 19650 series of standards, although it's got building information modeling in the title, an information model is a slightly different thing when we look at the standards. It's just a series of information that's being exchanged at a certain point in time. So I think the term is a little bit challenging in itself. But if there are some brilliant academic definitions, and if anybody's listening was interested, go and have a look at Chuck Eastman, their definition.
Right. Okay.
You can find, if you look in Transforming Infrastructure Performance, the roadmap to 2030, there's actually a definition in there as well that's quite helpful, and it does have the focus on information. I think as long as we think about BIM with a capital I for information and very much a lowercase p, because it's not all about buildings, it's about any asset, and a lowercase to be model or management or whatever,
So two out of the three letters might not be fully correct or giving you a good idea of what BIM is. And I agree with you. I think sometimes it feels like as BIM has evolved, it doesn't always fit neatly into what it originally was meant to stand for. And like you say, the 3D part, a lot of people think, it's about 3D. But what you say there about it being a data model is so important. And it's, going on to what Project Flux talks about, which is AI. I think the emergence of AI now allows people to see BIM through a different lens. So how do you see AI potentially enhancing the capabilities of BIM, or does it at all?
So I think that AI has got potential and can be really beneficial to the built environment. So I think the first thing is think about how we can remove the mundane out of what we can do or what we do using AI. But I think we can use AI to improve risk analyses, to improve optioneering, to increase predictability. And we've really got to do that, because we're not great at delivering assets either on time, on budget, or actually assets that do what they're supposed to do. So I think
there's some terrible stats on that, aren't there?
There are some really terrible stats on that, So I think if we can use AI to underpin, for instance, immersive experiences, then we can make better decisions in a more timely way, and we can optimize process. But importantly, we can optimize the product, how it operates. So I am all for looking at how we really work beneficially with AI. And I think I think the sort of challenge is that if we accept that it's there, rather than sort of putting barriers up against it, then if we accept it for what it is, I think it's a really important part of the answer. I don't think it's the answer itself, but I think it's a really important part of the answer.
It plays a role, doesn't it? Do you see people putting barriers in your profession, in the kind of academic profession? Are there some people, putting roadblocks up into the adoption of AI?
I don't think that there are barriers. I think that there is caution, probably, is the way to put it. I'm in an environment that is heavily research based, which is all about, what the future looks like. But when we're thinking about AI in an academic sense, in an educational sense, I think there's caution around it, because fundamentally we've got to be able to educate around how you work with, not how AI sort of, I don't know, overtakes what you do as a human being.
Yeah,
I think
that's
it's
the fear, isn't it?
complementary to human intelligence, but we need to understand how to deal with the outputs of AI.
But do you think that's similar with how we as humans should have adopted BIM, Sarah, in that sense?
In terms of barriers, do you think?
Well, just in terms of adopting AI, we need to use it as an assistant or a co-pilot, right?
Yeah.
But we still need to be in the driving seat.
Yeah.
So when you initially came into BIM, do you see that should have been a similar approach that we should have taken, or can you see some similarities there?
So I think that when we really started engaging with BIM and with the BIM Level 2 initiative, I think we saw it as an answer to a problem, but we saw that answer being modelling. And, in terms of, if we think about a geometrical model, then it does improve communication for definite. We get context, we can understand an environment better, and that's really important for clients and when we're in the design phase of a project. But we can get that with very limited data. And so I think that with BIM, we didn't quite have a focus on all the benefits that we wanted to achieve. And I think the other thing is that we all produce information. And so we maybe don't think that it needs to be treated in a special way. But of course it does, because we know that it's unreliable. So we needed to make sure that we really understood the consequences of poor information or incomplete information or insufficiently detailed information. We're all affected by that. I mean, as quantity surveyors, you spend a huge amount of your time trying to fill in those information gaps so that you can do your job.
And I think that there's a risk that with AI, that kind of reliance on information gets even harder, because you're not sure what is generated by a human and what has been generatively designed.
Yeah, and I think that that's where, as professions in the built environment, I think this is why accepting that it's there is really helpful, because if we accept it for what it is, then what we can do is look at how we develop our knowledge around understanding what's feeding the output, and then understanding actually what can we do with the output. So I think that there's a danger that we start to think that actually what the computer says is correct, but we know that what you put in has a huge influence on what you put out. And when we've been looking at development of the UK BIM framework guidance, we've got AI underpinning that. So you can ask the UK BIM framework guidance a question, what's a BIM execution plan? What do I need to do as an appointing party? You can be confident in the answer, because the AI is only working on the information that's within the UK BIM framework. And that's all been, that's got a lot of rigor sitting behind it.
Yes.
And so you can have confidence in the output. But if you were to do the same search using ChatGPT, for example, you would not get the same accuracy of response, because
it's
Yeah.
drawing on
it's drawing
information you
from
don't know.
so many different sources that you
Contextualized.
don't know.
Mm.
And so I think, if that's the thing we need to work with and understand what's feeding it and
Yes.
what the outcomes mean.
And that's what I'm seeing a lot of kind of use cases being developed at the moment. The kind of easy wins is that fine tuning of these ChatGPT models to information that people can trust. But before I ask you a little bit about your role in the NEMA or the UK BIM Alliance as it was, can I just put a kind of scenario? I'd like to see what you think of this. So one of the issues with not just BIM, but any kind of design, I suppose, is that it's only as good as the information you give it. So if you take a BIM model, for instance, if the data going into the BIM model is flawed, or you don't have, like we used to say as QSs, you can't measure the white noise or the white spaces where nothing's been filled in, then the output's going to be flawed.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I've always seen the BIM as a necessary step, but if you layer artificial intelligence on top of that to do its generative work to kind of fill in the gaps with caution and with the kind of bookending that we've talked about, making sure a human looks at it. To me, that seems like a really potential healthy relationship between two technologies or two methods that can then start producing outputs for clients that comes close to being something they can start working with. Is that a reasonable assumption, or do you think that's flawed?
No, I think it's a reasonable proposition, but there's a proviso to this, and that's providing everybody understands the purpose for the output, the purpose for the data and information that's going to be generated. So I always think of procuring information in the same way as you would procure an asset. So you go through a process. And the first part of that process is determining, well, the very first part when we think about a building is actually thinking about what do we need? Not we need a building, but what's the problem we're trying to solve? And is a building then the answer to that? And we need to do exactly the same with information. So there needs to be a specification for information driven by the client, supported by their team. Now, if the client, it's difficult specifying for information because you've really got to think in quite a granular level. And if the client maybe doesn't know what information that they need, then they need the help of the team. And if the team aren't quite sure how to generate that information, then I think that's where the AI can come in and start filling those gaps. But there has to be that definition of the information required in the first place. You couldn't, if you were procuring a simple example, if you were a homeowner and you wanted to build a new home, you would never say, build me a house or build me an apartment or build me whatever. There would be some criteria because you've established that you have a need. And so we need to take exactly the same approach with information. And I think if we can get that right, if we can identify firstly why we need information, and then what that information is, then I think that really opens the door for AI to come in and fill the delivery gaps.
Yeah, but could it be that AI also can help with establishing what that need and brief is? I find it very useful when you're staring at a blank page saying, I know I need to do something. And this doesn't have to be in building, it could be anything, but it can really help that creative process. Yeah. So even if it's defining the brief for an asset or a building, it can help with that as well.
Yeah. So I think for definite. So wherever you're operating in the world, but particularly we know about, the UK particularly well, there's information that has to be provided to meet regulatory requirements. There are processes that need to be done for regulatory requirements. And I suppose the one that is most prominent in all of our minds at the moment is the building safety regulations.
Yeah.
There it's information that has to be provided. So I think that AI can be used to say, okay, well, let's say that we know the answer to our problem is a school, for instance, And we know that the answer to the problem of the school is that it needs to accommodate 300 pupils. And we know that those pupils need to be occupying the school by September 2027. Then I think immediately what we can do is start predicting what's some of the information that's going to be needed, and also when that information is going to be needed. So you can start, for instance, to predict when you might submit a planning application, and when you're going to start on site, and therefore when you're going to submit your building regulations applications and so on. But I think that the AI in that instance can offer you a great starting point. But as I said, I think it's part of the answer. So I think that then let's say that you developed an AI model that could do that. I think that then there would be a critique of that and a supplementation to pick up on all those things that are specific to that particular asset or that particular client.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying very much ties in with what the London Property Association did a report, and one of their conclusions, they called it bookending, which is human at the beginning, algorithm in the middle, but human at the end. And I just love that, because 90% of cases, that kind of, wherever I've said that to somebody where they've got some kind of fear or concern around AI, that usually does trick. If we adopt that process, then I'm happy. I know Yoshi's got a question, but before we go into that, I just want could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with what was the UK BIM Alliance, which is now NEMA, please?
I can. So NEMA, as we now know it, is still very much around supporting the industry to transition towards data and information management or information-based ways of working. The UK BIM Alliance was always heavily involved in the contribution to the development of the ISO 19650 series of standards, and really in accordance with BSI, the British Standards Institute, it led the development of the guidance and also supporting resources such as information protocols and FAQs and things like that. So NEMA is still very much focused on helping the built environment transition towards data-oriented ways of working. It's working with BSI to develop the ISO 19650 series of standards. Guidance will continue to develop from there. NEMA is always looking at ways to connect individuals and organisations that are complementary to each other, that can help each other along. It's always looking at how do we support industry. So what resources are needed to help promote information management, to help embed it in organisations. I think that's where it needs to be. It needs to be really embedded so that it becomes business as usual.
Yes, and we're not quite there yet with it. So I think that's really important. And so for anyone listening in who's interested and wants to get involved with NEMA or find out more, where can they find out, or how can they get involved?
So you can find NEMA on LinkedIn. You can also search for NEMA on the internet, of course. If you do a search for Building Smart and NEMA, you'll find connections between them. Have a go to the UK BIM framework, so ukbimframework.org, and you'll find links in there to NEMA as well. So there are lots of ways, and just reaching out to me on LinkedIn or through email, or I can put people in touch with NEMA as well. But what I would really say is that sometimes we think about these initiatives as being a closed shop, or being, you have to be in the know to be part of them. And that's absolutely not the case. So NEMA genuinely is about outreach and is about helping people. So if help is needed, that's NEMA is the place to get that help, I think.
It's fantastic. And, whenever I've been at Digital Construction Week, they've got a stand there and the people there are super helpful. So we'll put all those links in the show notes so people can navigate their way and click the links through. So thank you so much for that, Sarah. Yoshi, I think you had a question for Sarah, did you?
Yeah, just a question. Typically, when we have some of the guests on the podcast, we always ask them a devil's advocate question, and James thought one that was really great, and it was that some critics argue that despite the years of development from when BIM has come out, there's been how it's meandered and evolved over time. Someone argued that it hasn't quite delivered the transformational change that was promised. What would you say to that response?
So I think that with any new initiative, there is an element of meandering. And I think that that can be frustrating, but when you look back on it, it's really valuable. You think about exploration work that you've done, and you always go down some dead ends, but you don't really regret them because you've always learned something from them. So I would say
never a straight line, is it?
No, it's not a straight line. So to those critics, I would say, okay, let's accept a degree of meandering. But I would also say that I would agree in some ways. I found it incredibly frustrating, that our language is still focusing mostly on geometrical modeling. Now, I think that we have done brilliant developments in terms of geometrical modeling. I think that what we can do now, we've got some super clever designers that can create some amazing designs in lots of different platforms. And they are reaping benefits from that way of working, but not all the benefits that they can reap. And I think that if we could just the heart of everything that we think about is how do we generate, the reliable, suitably detailed information that's going to be used. I think that we'll start to think about modeling a little bit differently. So I would say that there have been those really brilliant developments. I think that there have been some activities that have maybe put the brakes on a little bit, that have not helped us to move along quite as quickly as we might have. And I think that's also maybe limited collaboration, because we've not been able to use the data for all the things that we could use it for. But we know that systems integration is there. So we've got lots of different software that can work with data that comes out of modeling, that can do brilliant things. So I think if we can, recognize that not all information should be in a geometrical model. I think that's quite an important concept to grasp, because you don't want geometrical models to be data heavy, because then they become difficult to deal with. But also you've got to think about why you're getting the data into the model in the first place, and actually who's generating it. So I think if we can recognize that the originators will develop the information and data that's in their skill set, and they'll develop it in a way that works for what they need to do. If we can look at how we integrate data, then I think that is the way forward. When we're thinking about geometrical models, if we can be very clear on what data is to go in those models, but also how reliable it needs to be. So I think that there is some data that at certain points in an asset's life has to be accurate. You've got to know serial numbers around boilers, for instance. You've got to know their outputs. You've got to know their inputs. But you don't necessarily need to know precisely that a door frame is precisely, 150 millimeters away from the wall. Maybe there can be a degree of approximation about that. And we definitely don't need to know that data when we're in an early design stage. So I think if we can help,
it's interesting.
Sorry, James.
No, sorry. There's always a bit of a delay on this thing, but it was you just sparked something in my mind, because I remember a few weeks ago I did a presentation in Belfast for the ORCS, and it was to a bunch of QSs actually, and I asked how many people have used BIM models to extract quantities from, as an easy example, and a good sort of 70-80% said yes, and then I asked how many of you could rely on that information or trusted that information, and it was maybe 10%. So there's still like you say, the reliability of the data. It's all well and good having data in it, but if the people don't trust that data, then you may as well not have it.
But if at the outset, and this goes back to the specification for data and information at the very beginning. So if at the outset it's very clearly defined that the data that is generated through design is going to directly be used to inform quantity takeoff for the purpose of cost modeling, cost estimation, cost prediction, then you can have a conversation then about, well, how accurate does that need to be? And we know that in concept design stage, it doesn't have to be that accurate. We want to understand an approximate floor area. We want to sort of understand approximately how many doors we might have, or definitely, how many floors we're going to have and all of that sort of stuff. But when we get to detailed design stage, technical design stage, how accurate do we need it to be? Let's if we can express that right at the very beginning, then the door opens for that data that's in geometrical models to be usable for purposes such as cost management. Now, I still think that there is an onus on the QS to be putting the logic in their heads, or to be testing the logic that they know, to say, actually, does this stack up? What's the relationship between the area that I've got for ceilings compared to the area that I've got for floors?
Which is why you still need these professional...
You still need that logic, but what you shouldn't be doing is recreating the same quantities. Supplement them by all means. That we might price raking cutting, but we don't necessarily, that's, are we going to be able to get an automated quantity for that? We're probably going to have to do some work around it, because it's just a product of a modelled component, isn't it? But
Absolutely.
So there's supplementation, not duplication, I think. If we can think in that way, that's really helpful.
Which is similar, I think, to the whole AI debate. It's around augmenting or supplementing what we're doing, not necessarily replacing. Still need a human. That's really interesting. One more thing I want to sort of bring up before we draw this podcast to a close. We had a really interesting guy on the podcast last week called Ryan Clark, who's also interested in BIM. And we were talking quite a lot around, and I know it's not just geometrical, but a lot of people, when they talk about BIM, it conjures up images of 3D. And obviously the VR, AR space is changing all the time. And Meta recently released their new glasses, or not, it was kind of, they demoed glasses that will be available at some point. And then also seeing how kids are just really getting into the whole gaming world and the 3D world. Do you think that the whole way that people sort of develop 3D models and are used to using them is going to start changing as the next generation starts coming through, and they're used to wearing these VR glasses as just everyday experience?
Yeah, I think that even the current generation is coming from a different place. So, I just think back to kids playing games such as Minecraft. It already puts them in a completely different space. It puts them in a space where they understand a virtual environment, but also they understand how to create it. They understand what's informing it. And I think that if you can make modeling and data insights more engaging, whether that's through a sort of a gaming approach, or whether it's through a supplemented sort of approach, not dissimilar to Power BI, then I think
visualization.
Because the more that, so we don't, everybody has their own particular strengths and understandings around data and information, and what might, we talk about visualization, and because maybe from where we've come from, working with drawings isn't a problem because we've developed that ability to visualize. And we talk about visualization being very helpful to clients, but being able to immerse yourself in that space, not just being able to see it, but being really able to have the experience of it, is incredibly invaluable. And I think that the generation that's grown up engaging with different games, different experiences, I think that they probably understand that. But we need to think that everybody is I don't know, unique or will have a different strength around understanding data and information. So let's think about how we get it communicated in multiple ways so that we can get
Multimodal.
as much engagement with it as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the word, Yoshi, multimodal. Because
Yeah.
you're right, everyone's got a different kind of strength, haven't they? And that's we should use that as an advantage, not a disadvantage.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely
Definitely.
wonderful. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. We always like to give our guests sort of the last word. So if there's anything else you want to cover or anything else you want to say, now's your opportunity.
I think I would say, embrace the future, but think, as I said a couple of moments ago, think about developments in AI as being part of an answer, not the answer. I liked your bookending terminology, James. And I also think that, information management or the design, construction, operation of buildings, it's all about process, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
It's a roadmap to success. And we need to have those fundamental processes sitting beneath everything that we do. And so don't lose sight of them, but think about how we can make them easier to work with, how we can make life easier. I think that would be my takeaway. How do we make life easier so that we can really focus on where we bring value, whether that's through having really great insights into cost modeling or program modeling, or, how we get operator building, whatever it is. Think about how we can do that so that whenever the end of our day is, whether that's 5 o'clock or now we all work online a lot more, whether it's a bit later, we can actually switch off and spend time doing the things that we want to do.
Exactly.
And that means
it's about freedom, isn't it?
Gaining freedom. It's about freedom and having the choice. Whereas we're in danger of working so much that we don't enjoy it and we take away our choices. So think about how we use all of these developments to free our lives up and to make us, to really optimize what we can bring with our human intelligence.
Definitely, 100%.
That's a fantastic way to end the podcast, I think, on that very optimistic note. So, Sarah, thank you so much. We do hope you'll come on again, and we'll be making sure that we share all the links and all the things that you talked about, the UK BIM Alliance, on the show notes, so people can follow you or follow NEMA. So, I think we'll draw it to a close there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.